Welcome back everyone for the 7th episode of my campaign review and tier list series. Oh yeah, we're rocking lucky number 7 for probably one of the most anticipated episodes so far. For those who are new or need a recap, this is the series where I review each of AoE2 DE's official campaigns, breaking each down scenario by scenario, evaluating its strengths and weaknesses, and ultimately placing them on the tier list. Each episode covers 3 campaigns, going in chronological order from Alaric all the way through Bayanong. This is of course the 7th episode of the series, meaning we've completed 18 campaigns so far. Today we add another trio of campaigns to the list with Aloy, Joan of Arc, and the Grand Dukes. As always, I would just like to take a quick moment to say that these videos take a ton of time and energy to make, so if you are hyped for this episode, please be sure to leave a like, drop a comment, and of course subscribe to the channel for tons more AoE2 content. With our sellout completed, we're ready to get into the episode. This video will actually feature a full 18 scenarios, more than any episode so far, so let's get right into it by strapping on our M16, hopping into our Huey, and heading over to Nam. That's right. First up today will be the big final boss of all AoE2 DE campaigns, Aloy. Lasting from 1418 to 1427, this campaign serves as AoE2's showcase of the Vietnamese civilization and naturally has its origins in the Rise of Raja's expansion. Historically, Aloy was a Vietnamese noble turned king who led a successful uprising against the Ming Chinese occupation of Dai Viet, and that is indeed going to be the subject matter for the entire campaign. For the definitive edition, Aloy is another campaign with multiple designers, with scenarios 1, 2, and 5 being done by Freeman, and scenarios 3, 4, and 6 done by Bassi. According to Bassi, this campaign was originally a collaboration between Freeman and some campaign designers who no longer work for Forgotten Empires. Therefore, just like Yodit, Freeman did the remakes of the scenarios he originally designed, whereas Bassi did the other levels. I specifically use the word redesigned here because more than most campaigns, Bassi's scenarios in Aloy feature some pretty drastic gameplay changes compared to HD, which in general make the scenarios play out a bit more smoothly as build and destroy missions. Fun background info aside, what players are most likely to remember about the Aloy campaign is its difficulty. Especially after other campaigns received changes to make certain scenarios easier, I'd say that overall, Aloy is the single most difficult campaign in the entire game. From start to finish, be ready for some massive slugfests in every mission. And now we're going to see exactly why Aloy is so feared as it's time to trudge through the campaign's scenarios. First up today is the Dai Viet Uprising, where the Vietnamese rebels need to make their first strikes against their Ming occupiers. You begin with a scattered force to the center of a very large map, and to win you must clear out the Ming soldiers from the 5 Vietnamese villages scattered across the region. There are tons of Chinese troops in these villages, as well as plenty more patrolling the roads, so you will need to build up a pretty large force. In addition to liberating the villages, you must also protect the fortresses of your 2 allies, the Nguyen and the Trinh. These powerful Vietnamese families will put up a pretty stout defense against the Ming, but will eventually fall without your support. There are a couple of side quests here as well, but your core gameplay is just clearing out those Vietnamese villages while defending the fortresses of your allies from the hordes of Ming soldiers. So way back when DE first came out, I actually had this level as the number 5 hardest scenario in the game. I don't know if the Dai Viet Uprising received any changes over the past couple years, but I will say that it feels easier now than it used to. I specifically say easier because the level is still quite challenging, as your allies will eventually fall without your support, and your resources and pop limit are pretty low. However, more than the difficulty, the thing that stands out the most to me here is just how sluggish the pacing is. You start in the feudal age without any real economy or infrastructure, and you just kinda need to wait around until you get to your full army of rattan archers and battle elephants. From there, it's just a matter of keeping your allies alive while you patrol your way across the other Vietnamese villages. All in all, a pretty meh start to Aloy in my opinion. Oh boy, second in our Vietnamese campaign is the Mountain Siege. Things aren't going so well for our rebels, as Aloy, as well as his second-in-command Lei Lai, find themselves trapped in a mountain fortress by the Ming. Although you are completely surrounded by a superior army, the area to the east is only lightly defended, so your first task is to cut your way through the Ming in that direction to create an escape route. Once you do that, groups of allied soldiers will periodically spawn in your fortress and make their way east to the exit. Once 40 of your men escape, as well as Aloy himself, you will win the scenario. However, while all of this is going on, you still need to defend your fortress, located in the center of the map. Now, control of its defenses are split between you and Lei Lai, and you need to make sure that at least one of the 3 castles remains standing throughout the entire scenario. Of course, the Ming will not sit by idly while you're doing all of this, as they will be quite relentless in attacking both the fortress and your escape route. Their own base is essentially impenetrable due to your lack of siege equipment, so your best bet is to fulfill your objectives as quickly as possible. Alrighty, so I pretty frequently see people in the community dub the Mountain Siege as the single most difficult level in the entire game. I used to not really understand this because I always thought of the scenario as not that challenging, especially compared to some of the other ones in this campaign. However, in replaying this mission to collect the background footage, I realized that the Mountain Siege has been changed to be more difficult, as now the Blue Ming army regularly attacks your eastern flank and the soldiers that are trying to flee. Now, I would say that this is kinda strangely the most challenging level in the entire campaign, and would likely make a revised top 5 hardest scenarios list. Beyond the difficulty aspect, the Mountain Siege is an okay-ish level. The flavor is totally there, as is the challenge, but I do think that there are some aspects of the scenario that are pretty clunky. Oftentimes, the escaping allied units will stop, get stuck, or just not count towards your 40-soldier objective. Also, sharing a base with AI players is kind of awkward. And lastly, I do have to say that this mission really throws off the sort of progression aspect of the Lei Loi campaign, as you go from feudal age guerrilla fighters all the way to an incredibly challenging Imperial Age slugfest after only one scenario. After our big Imperial Age defense versus the Ming in the previous scenario, the next Lei Loi mission, the Battle at Hanoi, takes us back to being feudal age guerrilla fighters. You start with a small army to the south of the map, and must ultimately find a way to destroy the 2 castles in the center of Hanoi to take back the city. Before you can think about facing the Ming head-on, however, you're going to need to weaken them and build up a better army. The first part of the level has you doing just that, as you snake your way around the outskirts of Hanoi, ambushing patrols, helping locals, and gathering soldiers. Eventually, you'll make your way to the mountain rebels to the far north of the map, who will give you some buildings and villagers to launch your attack on Hanoi. You can do this by both land and sea, because apparently Hanoi is now a coastal city, but regardless, the west of the map is dominated by a shallow coastal area with plenty of fish. It's a straightforward fight against the Ming from then on, as you just need to destroy their castles to win the scenario, but you do need to be sure that it's the 2 castles at the center of Hanoi, because there's a castle actually to the north of Hanoi, which doesn't count for some reason. So I'd say that the battle at Hanoi is probably the most changed scenario in this campaign from HD to DE. Back in ye old days, this level was insanely difficult due to the infinite resources of the Chinese and your inability to train more villagers. You could capture like 10 to 12 or so, but they had to be pretty much your only source of income. Also, there was no naval aspect like in the DE version, and there were several more side quests that were all rather clunky to play out. You can actually see the legacy of this with the random yurts that are in the walled area to the northeast of Hanoi. I believe that it used to be a prison where you had to rescue units that were trapped in the huts. Regardless, it's clear that the DE version attempts to give you much more of a streamlined experience, eliminating most of the RPG-like side quests and ultimately giving you a base from which to siege Hanoi. I can't say that the battle at Hanoi is my favorite level out there due to the lack of resources and slow start, but it's still far, far better than it was back in HD. With the north secure and the Ming armies cut off from China, it's time to go on the offensive in the campaign's 4th scenario, reaching south. A notable step back in intensity from the previous missions, this level has you begin with a small camp to the west of the map, with your objective being to seize control of the 3 gunpowder stores located in the large Ming fortress to the east. To do this, you simply need to destroy the keep adjacent to the marked building, but to take all 3, you pretty much need to level the entire fortress anyway. Beyond the fortress's Imperial Age garrison, there are 2 other Chinese armies with which you must contend. The most immediate threat is the main Ming army, who control the roads to the north of the map, not far from your camp. However, they are fairly weak and can fall pretty quickly. You also have the famous Chinese general Wang Tong arriving in the area. He does not possess an actual camp, but rather will send a few waves of units at your base. These waves will increase in strength until the final one is a pretty big army. The final thing to note here is that there is a small village to the west of your camp, and defeating the Ming garrison there will allow the villagers to occasionally tribute you food. So as I mentioned, reaching south is definitely one of those mid-campaign break levels. You have a smaller pop limit than in the previous 2 scenarios at only 120, and the map is pretty small, your objective straightforward, and this is probably the easiest scenario in the campaign. The initial waves of enemy soldiers can be devastating if you're caught off guard, but once you get a big mass of rattan archers, you can pretty much plow through everything. Another okay-ish scenario overall, this is another level that was changed a fair bit from HD. Back then, the scenario was, I think, a little bit more difficult, but also you had this weird mechanic with like the Ming Navy that would sail up the river, and you had to find like a spot to build a bunch of towers to stop them, and you had to build a wonder. It was kinda weird. These days, my biggest gripe with reaching south is just the premise of having to steal Chinese gunpowder. You can already train gunpowder units. The Chinese don't make any gunpowder units here, and in the next scenario, the Chinese are going to be totally fine as they possess plenty of bombard towers. It's just really weird all around. Our penultimate scenario in Lê Loi is a three-pronged attack, where Lê Loi's commanders must divide and conquer the armies of the Ming, as well as siege the city of Nei'an. Your objectives in this mission are twofold. You must both defeat the army of Wang Tong that is located to the northeast, as well as capture the monument in Nei'an to the south. After a short intro, you will find yourself controlling 3 camps, each cut off from the other by either mountains or enemy fortifications, hence the name of the scenario. Each camp is commanded by a different hero unit, and will play a different role in completing your objectives. The westernmost camp is located in a wetland with plenty of resources and will not be attacked by your enemies. However, you cannot get to either Nei'an or Wang Tong without pushing through the Ai Lao. The Laotians are not aggressive, but they will defend their territory if you try to push past them. Meanwhile, your center camp consists of only a few military buildings and no economy. However, it is strategically positioned to intercept resource shipments from the main Ming army to the camp of Wang Tong. Your final camp is to the east, and it's likely going to be your main base of operations. From there, you can easily attack both Nei'an and Wang Tong, although in turn this means that your enemies will attack you from both east and south. Alrighty, so there's clearly quite a lot going on here in a 3-pronged attack, but to be honest, I really enjoy this scenario, and definitely think that it's the strongest in the whole campaign. The split base dynamic is quite interesting, denying the resource shipments to Wang Tong is challenging but totally worth it, and the overall mission gives you that big epic build and destroy feel that has not really been present in Lê Loi up to this point. You get a full 200 population limit, begin in the Imperial Age, and have to carefully balance building your economy with defending your camp and stopping the Ming reinforcements. Lastly, I believe that a 3-pronged attack does a really nice job of giving you just the right amount of resources. It's enough to give you a super strong post-imp army, but not so many as to make cost efficiency totally worthless. Of course, this is one of our 6 scenario FE campaigns, and Lê Loi's final mission is appropriately titled The Final Fortress. Clearly meant to be the big climactic battle against Wang Tong and the Ming. After a large intro fight, you're given a big ol' camp, tons of resources, and a whopping 250 pop limit to take down this gigantic Ming fortress of Dongdo that dominates the center of the map. To win, you need to destroy all 7 castles located within the fortress, which is further protected by walls, bombard towers, and an unending tide of post-imp Chinese units. In addition, you will also have to contend with the armies of the Ming Vanguard, who control relatively large camps to both the east and west of Dongdo. They will also send tons of post-imp Chinese units at you, and will be much more aggressive in doing so compared to the fortress. I would highly recommend that you defeat them before attempting to siege the Ming castles. Beyond the 2 Ming armies, there really isn't much else to this mission. Just get a massive eco built up to your Vietnamese death ball of battle elephants for late Rattan archers, siege, and bombard towers, and then grind your way to victory. So yeah, although the grand scope of the final fortress is certainly an appropriate way to end the Lê Loi campaign, the actual gameplay of the level itself leaves much to be desired. At its core, the final fortress just feels really grindy and uninteresting. I mean, you've already fought Imperial Age Chinese units in the previous 4 levels, and have had to attack super fortified Chinese bases in at least 2 of them, if not 3. The very straightforward nature of this scenario just really doesn't feel like it adds anything to the campaign. In addition to the redundancy issue, this is an incredibly grindy fight as you're just trying to snipe production buildings to slow down the spam of enemy units. To be honest, the final fortress is a pretty disappointing end to Lê Loi, and it makes me wish that we had just ended with the previous level. With our journey through the scenarios of Lê Loi completed, as always, it's time to broaden our analysis to the overall strengths and weaknesses of the campaign. Yeah, Lê Loi is really tough, but what else does it have going for it? Well, starting of course with the strengths, I do just want to start off by praising the consistent challenge level of Lê Loi. Obviously, you don't want every campaign in the game to be an exhausting slog, but I really appreciate having at least 1 or 2 that really push the limits of a player's ability. It's not like you need to be 2K plus rating to beat every level, far from it, but still, I feel like Lê Loi's difficulty is a good way to encourage players to improve. Also, hard campaigns mean players are more likely to search online for guides, which in turn bring them to my YouTube channel, so really, this is all an evil, selfish plot. In all seriousness, I know that I'm not the only player who really likes a challenge when it comes to playing an AoE2 campaign, and I really do have to give Lê Loi a lot of credit for being just that. Okay, difficulty aside, there are still other positive things that I can say about Lê Loi. Even if I don't think that most of the scenarios were that fun, they still do a good job of highlighting the strengths of the Vietnamese civilization. Rattan archers are excellent at dealing with Chukonu with their very high pierce armor, imp skirms are fantastic in situations where you have little gold with which to work, even Vietnamese battle elephants have a chance to shine as a meat shield for your ranged army, and they will do work against all of the buildings and heavy cavalry that you'll have to fight through. Ignoring the weird stuff going on in the 4th scenario, Vietnamese gunpowder is really helpful throughout the campaign, as bombard cannons are powerful against archers and onagers, and bombard towers can really help anchor a slow push into the many Chinese-controlled cities that you'll end up fighting. An important aspect of every campaign is to show off its civilization, its best units, playstyle, the role of its unique unit, etc. And from that perspective, Lê Loi does a good job. Unfortunately, this is kinda where the good stuff in Lê Loi comes to an end. Yeah, this campaign has a lot of issues. First and foremost, other than the 5th scenario, none of the missions are very fun. They mostly feel quite slow in their pacing and involve a lot of you doing the same thing over and over again. A large reason for this, in my view, is the campaign's lack of variety. Besides a tiny cameo from the Malay in the 1st level, this campaign features only 2 civs, the Vietnamese and the Chinese. On top of that, all of your main opponents in every single scenario is Chinese, the Ming. The only exception to this is Nha An, which is Vietnamese. Even so, you still have both Wang Tong and the Ming army to contend with in that level, so it's not like you're not fighting any Chinese. I understand that the subject matter of the campaign's story kind of necessitates this repetition, but unfortunately that doesn't really do anything to make the scenarios feel diverse. Lastly, and related to the story, the narrative of this campaign is just not good. To clarify, I have no issues with choosing a historical narrative based around Lê Loi as the subject matter for the Vietnamese campaign. Here I'm specifically referring to how the story is told, particularly when it comes to the in-between game slides. If you remember from back in HD, the story of the Lê Loi campaign was told by Wang Tong himself, but for DE, this was changed to a generic, detached narrator. I understand wanting to have the Lê Loi campaign told from the Vietnamese perspective, but the way that this was done was just boring. The slides are short, they only give a very basic overview as to what's going on, and do nothing to connect the player to the actual compelling story that is Lê Loi's rebellion. Of course, feel free to have a different opinion than me, but I just can't get myself excited to play the Lê Loi campaign other than the 5th mission, which, like I said, I do really enjoy. Well, with all of that said, we return to the good old tier list, and now we have to place Lê Loi. I know a good number of people are going to disagree with me, but in my eyes, this is a very clear C tier campaign. More than anything else, to me, Lê Loi is just not very fun. The lackluster storytelling definitely makes it hard for me to get into the scenarios, but at the end of the day, it's just really all about gameplay. It just feels like I'm doing the same thing over and over and over again, and that slow pacing gets really boring really fast. That said, Lê Loi is still one of the more frequently discussed campaigns in the AoE2 community, and not without reason. I honestly do give our Vietnamese campaign a lot of credit for its challenge, as well as its showcase of the Vietnamese civilization itself. And for that, Lê Loi is comfortably saved from the D tier, but alas, it cannot go any higher. August 26th, PC chez Ornlu. Oh man, it is time for maximum nostalgia, as our second campaign of the day is none other than La Pucelle herself, Joan of Arc. Lasting from 1428 to 1453, our Frank campaign is of course one of the most iconic campaigns in the entire game and a naturally part of the Age of Kings. In fact, Joan of Arc was literally the first campaign ever created by Ensemble Studios. For the definitive edition, this campaign was done by Freeman, who kept the gameplay pretty much the same as the original version, with the only notable changes being the increased pop limit in most levels, as well as the Burgundian Civ swap that came with the Lords of the West expansion. But regardless of the game version, Joan of Arc follows the story of one of the most famous and compelling narratives of the entire AoE2 timeframe, as Joan's tale famously has her going from essentially a peasant to revitalizing the French army after decades of defeats against the English, to ultimately being captured and turned into a martyr as the English burn her at the stake. Because it is such a great story and it also features the most popular civilization in the Franks, Joan of Arc was the very first campaign for a lot of AoE2 players, myself included. Concerning its difficulty, it should come as no surprise that Joan of Arc is a one-sword campaign. It's very simple and pretty easy, although the last couple of scenarios can certainly throw you for a loop if you're not prepared. And with all of that intro stuff complete, let's take a trip down memory lane and go through the Joan of Arc scenarios. The first mission in the Joan of Arc campaign is An Unlikely Messiah, where the teenage Joan the Maid must safely be escorted through the war-torn French countryside to meet with the Dauphin Charles, the rightful monarch of France. This is a simple A to B mission, with Joan beginning alone in a camp to the east of the map with her two knightly escorts, Sieur Bertrand and Jean de Metz. After exiting the camp at Vaucouleurs, you will quickly find yourself witnessing a big battle between the army of France and the English. You must watch from the sidelines as the French get absolutely clapped by the English, but can proceed after the English leave. After encountering some highwaymen, you will find that you need to get past a walled Burgundian village, but thankfully there are some reinforcements to the north. Once through the village, you will get ambushed by the Burgundian army, forcing you to escape downriver. Finally, after only a couple more skirmishes, you make it to Chinon and win the level. So an unlikely Messiah has a twofold task, to not just introduce you to the Joan of Arc story, but also to the Age of Empires 2 campaigns as a whole. According to my 1999 Age of Kings strategy guide, this is why our first Joan of Arc scenario is an A to B mission that features a big battle in the very beginning. The ensemble devs didn't want you to just be plopped down with a TC and 3 villagers, but to focus the player on the units and battles that were possible in the game. All that said, this is of course an incredibly easy scenario, but it does do a nice job of introducing the Joan of Arc story. Everything from watching the French army get annihilated to fearing attacks from various bands of enemies really highlights just how grim the situation was for France in their century-long struggle versus England. Second up in Joan of Arc is the Maid of Orleans, which has the player experience Joan's first major and perhaps most famous victory while being the figurehead of the French army. The scenario starts as another A to B sequence with Joan, her escort, and the Duc d'Alençon ready to depart from Chinon in the far south of the map. First, you must meet up with the French army and its supply carts in the town of Blois, and from there must make it across the Loire River to come to the aid of the large city of Orleans, which dominates the north center of the map. Once Joan arrives with the supply carts, you take control of the city and receive your main objective for the scenario, to break the siege of Orleans by destroying one of the 4 English castles in the area, while also ensuring that the cathedral in Orleans remains standing. You have plenty of resources, but only start in the feudal age with a few villagers, so it will likely be helpful to secure the numerous farms to the west of the city to help give you a steady economy. Once you are up and running, you have the choice to take on the North British or the South British, each of which have 2 fortified castles protecting their camps. The 2 British forces train different armies, but are pretty much equally easy to take down with your Frankish knights. Alright, so the Maid of Orleans is our first chance to get a base and train units with the Franks. I will say that I really like the intro A to B section, as it has you actually play out the gathering of the army and resources that you need to relieve the defense force in Orleans. Also, like the rest of this campaign, muscling down the Briton archers and defenses with Frank knights and rams is going to be your best bet. Still, this mission is incredibly simple and easy, as neither English army or the Burgundian really do a whole lot to stop you. After securing Orleans, our third Joan of Arc scenario has us remove the rest of the English strongholds in the area in the appropriately titled The Cleansing of the Loire. You begin with Joan, a few villagers, and a reasonably sized army, which notably features the infamous La Hire, on a small strip of land on the south side of the Loire River. There are some transports nearby to ferry your army, but you must scout for a good place to build up your camp on the far side of the river. The main objective here is simple: destroy 3 of the 4 English castles scattered around the map. Indeed, the English will be your main opponent in this scenario, but they also have some support. The Burgundians have set up their camp to the west of the map, and their small force can be a bit of an annoyance early on. They will also sling resources to your final enemy, the English commander Sir John Fastolf. He controls a small camp to the far east of the map, but will eventually grow to be the strongest enemy in the game, even able to research the Imperial Age while you are restricted to the Castle Age. Regardless, it's not difficult to kill Fastolf with your starting army, and from there it's a straightforward boom into knights plus rams into destroy the enemy castles. So I would say that the Cleansing of the Loire does ramp up the difficulty a little bit compared to the previous level, but is still very much on the simple and easy side of the AoE2 campaign spectrum. Your enemies do train reasonably large armies, and you do need plenty of knights and rams to take down the English castles, but to be honest, this feels more grindy than difficult. The map is quite large, and you're stuck in the Castle Age with battering rams, so the level can take quite a while to complete. The Loire River also plays a really insignificant role in the scenario, because after you cross it, you can pretty much forget about it for the rest of the game. Of course, the obvious redeeming factor of this scenario is the dialogue. La Hire's third-person jabs are some of the most memorable in the entire game, as are Fastolf's condescending taunts. I mean, who could forget, La Hire wishes to kill something, or methinks this peasant girl should go back to her sheep. It's just classic, man. With the French heartland back under our control, it's finally time to crown Prince Charles in the 4th Joan of Arc scenario, The Rising. Once again, you begin with Joan of Arc and a moderately sized army to the southeast of the map, and must travel due west to reach the camp of the French army. There are some English soldiers camped out along the way, but they are easily dealt with. Upon reaching the camp, you'll get a small economy as well as your main objective for the scenario: destroy the enemy town center of each of the occupied French cities, Chalon, Troyes, and Rheims. A river splits the map in 2, with your side only being home to a few enemy towers. This means that you can simply wall the 2 crossings and then boom comfortably to the Imperial Age. Your enemies may transport over, but never in any great strength. Sniping the TCs of Chalon and Troyes are quite easy as the towns are not walled, and once destroyed, each enemy will delete its army and then become your ally. Rheims is your only formidable opponent, as they are also able to reach the Imperial Age, possess strong defenses, and train a powerful army of longbows, knights, and mangonels. Nevertheless, you only need to snipe their town center to win. I would say that the Rising feels kind of like a mid-campaign break scenario, as it's definitely a step backwards in terms of difficulty. Still, as I will get to shortly, the final 2 missions in the Joan of Arc campaign are actually pretty tough, so I'd say that this break is warranted. It's just that in this level, it's so easy to defend your 2 tiny choke points, giving you all the time in the world to get to your post-imp Frankish paladins. You can even snipe both Chalon and Troy with little more than your starting army, leaving you only with Rem left to fight. I wouldn't say that the Rising is a bad level by any means, as it does progress the campaign in terms of the story with you preparing for the coronation of Prince Charles, and it's also the first scenario where you can reach the Imperial Age. It's just not the most memorable scenario in the campaign. Our 5th Joan of Arc scenario is the nightmare of many a young AoE2 player, the Siege of Paris. This is another A to B scenario, but with you controlling a large, irreplaceable army, much like in Barbarossa's March. You begin with said large army to the south of the map, including mostly pikemen and crossbowmen, but with a few heavy cavalry and siege units to complement them. Your first task is to rescue and protect 6 of the refugees that are located in English-controlled Paris, and then await the arrival of your promised reinforcements. However, even getting to the refugees is quite the challenge, as there are post-imp Britain units swarming the entire city, attacking any allied unit that gets in range. The range part is particularly relevant here because you can easily draw the aggro of some 12 range elite longbowmen, which will retreat and then lead you into another nest of Britain soldiers, hence why this level was a nightmare for many players. Anyway, once you reach the rendezvous point with the French army, you will get some much needed reinforcements, in the form of 1 scout cavalry and 1 militia. Yeah, you've got to get the heck out of Dodge, which in this case means safely escorting Joan and the 6 refugees to the castle of Compiègne, just northeast of Paris. After battling your way through the city, you will eventually break out, but then just before reaching the safety of Compiègne, you'll be attacked by a massive Burgundian army. They are only on neutral stance to you, so they won't attack your villagers, so you just need to make sure that Joan survives long enough to make it to the flagged area. Okay, so yeah, the Siege of Paris. This mission is, how do I say this? Somewhat frustrating. The super long-range longbowmen I can deal with, the poor upgrades on your units I can deal with. The thing that puts me over the edge is the fact that the English are on enemy stance to you, so they will target your villagers. Yes, you can get 2 additional villagers to get a little bit of leeway, but still, with all of the long-range units, buildings, and ships of the Britons, it's really easy to just get 140 HP villager sniped, making you lose the level. Speaking of ships, those galleons and cannon galleons are super annoying to deal with due to AI micro. Yeah, not my favorite mission out there. Alas, Joan has been captured and executed by the English and Burgundians, meaning the final scenario of the campaign, a perfect martyr, has you taking command of the remaining French army to deal one final blow against the English. You begin only with Guy Josselin, the fictional French commander and narrator of the campaign, and a trade cart carrying the French flag. However, you will swiftly meet up with the rest of the French army, which includes units that aren't even available to Franks, like arbalests and hussars with full upgrades. Also, you get several hero units, including everybody's favorite third-person speaking badass Lahire. Your main objective here is simple: escort the trade cart carrying the French flag to the designated hill in the English stronghold of Castillon. Still, you lack an economy, and the pretty small map is almost entirely occupied by enemy forces. The Burgundians command a sizable fortress in the center, as well as a smaller camp to the south across the river. In a clifftop fortress to the north is the Earl of Shrewsbury, who commands the English cavalry. Lastly, the main English army controls a massive sprawl of fortifications and soldiers that take up the entire western portion of the map. The recommended course of action here is to use your army to take out the central Burgundian fortress, as once you destroy their town center, you will gain control of the fort's walls and resources and can use it as your base of operations. From here, the level is pretty straightforward, if not quite challenging. You are 3v1, so it would probably be a good idea to knock out Shrewsbury and the remaining Burgundians before your final slugfest against the English. Well, a perfect martyr is certainly a memorable way to wrap up the Joan of Arc campaign. The symbolic victory of placing the French flag on the hill in Castillon is just so fitting for the symbolic figurehead that was Joan of Arc. This is definitely my favorite scenario in the campaign, as it really does tie together all of the characters and factions of the campaign for one big final battle. As I mentioned, the level is also quite tough, and I believe it was made more difficult in DE with the English being much more aggressive. Of course, I do like a challenge, but I also appreciate how you aren't given just a ton of resources and villagers and just go to town spamming paladins at the enemy. You need to actually capture an enemy base to get your own economy, and even from there, you will need to hold off a ton of Imperial Age units before you yourself can go on the offensive. I just feel like that whole dynamic makes this scenario more interesting than just your basic boom and smash your enemy in the face type of gameplay. So, those are the scenarios of the Joan of Arc campaign, and now we need to do our best to take off our rose-tinted nostalgia goggles to really dig into what worked in this campaign and what did not, because yes, in truth, Joan of Arc is very far from perfect. Still, as always, let's first consider what are the strengths of the Joan of Arc campaign, because this really is a fan favorite. Above all else, Joan just has one of the most compelling narratives in the entire game. I mean, there is a reason that she was chosen as the first historical figure of the Middle Ages to have a campaign about. But even with a strong historical narrative as a base, the Ensemble devs did have to actually implement Joan's story into the framework of an AoE2 campaign, and on that front, they definitely knocked it out of the park. I really like the decision to go with a fictional account of a French commander, in this case Guy Josselin, instead of Joan, the Dauphin, or anyone else. Guy's journals do an excellent job of painting a vivid image as to just how desperate and dejected the French army was after a century of getting their butts kicked by the English. In turn, once Joan arrives, you can see how she was really able to inspire the French army to keep going and turn the tide of the war. Yes, it's true that Joan wasn't actually the one leading the troops into battle, but she was still very much involved on the front lines, and being that inspirational figure turned out to be what the French needed more than anything else. I know I'm talking a lot about this, and I'm sure I don't really need to justify my liking for the Joan of Arc story, but I still think it's important to do my best to sort of spell out why it's so memorable. Another great thing about Joan of Arc, and this is kind of related to the story, but it's just the characters and dialogue within the scenarios themselves is just excellent. You have every single line of English dialogue just being so condescending and patronizing that it makes you love to hate them. You've just got to appreciate lines such as when you destroy one of the English castles north of Orleans in Joan 2. "Since we are a generous people, we will allow you to stay in Orleans, but France belongs to England now. Never forget that." On top of that, you have the in-game hero units like Lahia and Fastoff who have some of the most memorable lines in the entire game. Who could argue with, "An army of rams? How quaint." And, "Do your worst, you English fop." Unfortunately, now I need to blow up the nostalgia train by talking about the many issues within Joan of Arc. Simply put, its gameplay has not aged well, especially compared to the other Age of Kings campaigns. I know it's supposed to be the introductory campaign, but still, the scenarios for the most part just lack any real complexity or difficulty. To explain what I mean by this, when it comes to lacking complexity, there are a few things that we can find missing within the Joan of Arc scenarios. For example, there are no real optional side quests or objectives in pretty much any scenario here, which could give the player something to do while they are building up. If I'm not being attacked very often and don't have anything else to really pay attention to, I'm kinda just left waiting around until I build up my big army. The generally sluggish gameplay also plays a role here, as your pop limits all tend to be on the lower side, and you also tend to start in lower ages like feudal or castle age even later into the campaign. Even if you brush off the complexity issue as a necessity of an intro campaign, I do feel like the campaign's near complete lack of variety is much harder to forgive. I mean, Joan of Arc features a grand total of 3 civilizations: Franks, Britons, and Burgundians. And even then, Burgundians were only added in as their own civ with Lords of the West. Much like Leloy, it just gets kind of boring to fight Britons over and over and over again, especially when they almost never even train halbs to deal with your Frankish cavalry. And for that matter, you never even get a good opportunity to make use of the Frankish unique unit, the Throwing Axeman, at any point ever in Joan. Lastly, I've got to mention that your objectives are literally destroy the specific enemy castles or town centers in half the missions in this campaign, and the other half all have you escorting one unit from one side of the map to the other as a core mechanic. Doesn't really help spice things up. Well, now the time has come. With all of that said, where is our Maid of Orleans going to end up on the tier list? In the end, I decided to be generous and place the campaign in B tier. As to why I'm squeezing Joan into B tier instead of C tier, there are a couple of important factors. Yes, the story of Joan is great, but so are the stories of all of the C tier campaigns I've placed so far. I do feel like Joan of Arc still has the edge story-wise over El Cid, Longshanks, and Leloy, but it is counteracted by the fact that Joan probably has the weakest gameplay of the 4. So why does La Pucelle get the bump? You guys can of course disagree, but to me, Joan of Arc deserves a lot of respect for being literally the first campaign in AoE2. The designers had nothing to go off of when making the campaign, and in turn, the design choices of Joan of Arc serve as the basis for literally all subsequent campaigns. Sure, this might not have the most exciting gameplay in the world, but Joan's story is still one of the most memorable experiences in AoE2 even after all of these years, and that is definitely not easy to achieve on a first try. Last, but certainly not least for today, is the Grand Dukes of the West. Lasting from 1407 to 1431, the Grand Dukes campaign serves as AoE2-DE's showcase of the Burgundian civilization, being designed by Bassi as part of the Lords of the West expansion. Once again, astute viewers may note the dates of this campaign, and yes, I am cheating my chronological ordering of these campaigns a little bit in this video, as the Grand Dukes come slightly before Joan of Arc. However, our Burgundian campaign focuses on the exploits of John the Fearless and his son Philip the Good, both of whom led their dukedom's forces against the French royalists that we play as in Joan of Arc. Because of this, I thought it would be better to frame our good guy, bad guy dynamic that we have with the Joan of Arc and Grand Dukes campaigns by going through the original one first, and then the more recent adaptation of the conflict second. Also, many of Bassie's design choices in this campaign are based off of what you see in Joan of Arc, and I wanted to be able to point those out throughout this segment. Anyway, let's keep this show rolling. The difficulty of the Grand Dukes is set at 2 swords. As we will see, this campaign is very classic in its design with many build and destroy scenarios, but without the sort of crazy high unit expand that you might find in something like Leloy. It's pretty middle of the road in terms of challenge, so that seems good. So with all of that prelude, let's see what our conniving Burgundian dukes have going for them in their scenarios. First up here is A Kingdom Divided, where John the Fearless must assist his brother-in-law, the Duke of Bavaria, in putting down a rebellion in the city of Liège. You begin with a modest castle-age camp to the far west of the map, with your initial objective being to take down 2 of the 3 castles located within the walls of Liège, which occupies most of the east center of the map. The Duke of Bavaria will provide you support from his own camp to the north, and you can also take advantage of the vulnerable countryside around Liège to politely borrow extra resources from the definitely willing peasants. However, around 15 minutes into the level, it is revealed to you that the Armagnac faction in Paris is pressing charges against you for murdering the insane King of France. Rather displeased by the news, your main objective changes from destroying the 2 castles to actually needing to slaughter enough villagers of Liège to drop their total count to below 15. As well defended as Liège is, their economy is mostly located outside of its walls, so the level becomes much more about raiding rather than sieging. Alrighty, so A Kingdom Divided definitely sets the pace for the Grand Dukes campaign when it comes to both gameplay and style. On the one hand, you have a classic build and destroy type mission with a small twist or two, and on the other, you really get this sense that you are playing as the bad guys. However, as we will see throughout this campaign, it's not the cartoonish, "Wahaha, I want to rule the world" type villain, but more of the cold, calculating villain who uses people in whatever way they can to gain power. The change in objective to killing the civilian population of Liège just to make your point to your political rivals in Paris very much underscores this. Second in the Grand Dukes is The Wolf and the Lion, and no, this has nothing to do with Game of Thrones, at least that I know of. You begin with John the Fearless and his army arriving in the south of the map, horrified to see that the Ile-de-France region has been ravaged by the rival Armagnac faction. First, you need to clear out the Ecochères from a small village in the middle of the map, which is not too difficult since your army is far superior. After claiming the village for your own, you get your choice of main objective. You can A. Defeat Bernard d'Armagnac, who is your most powerful enemy controlling a sprawling fortress to the northwest. B. Defeat the 3 Armagnac allies, Jean de Bourbon, Charles d'Orléans, and Jean d'Alençon. And yes, this is the same Duc d'Alençon from Joan 2. Each of them controls smaller fortresses spread throughout the map. Or C. Capture all 4 relics. Each is housed in a monastery just outside of one of the French fortresses. There are also a couple unique mechanics in this level to spice things up. You have 8 neutral villages spread throughout the area, and capturing these will slowly generate income. These villages can constantly be taken by all players, however. Lastly, there are the English mercenaries that are kind of hanging out to the northwest, whose services can be purchased for a moderate fee. Okay, so you can see that The Wolf and the Lion expands the scope of the campaign by quite a lot, as this mission features a large map, multiple routes to victory, and a 200 pop limit with access to full Imperial Age techs. This is kind of surprising so early in the campaign, but as far as the level itself goes, I really enjoy it. Just another solid build and destroy level with an interesting village control mechanic. Thematically, this scenario is the big battle between the rival Burgundian and Armagnac factions for control of France, and The Wolf and the Lion does a really nice job of playing that out with you fighting over the various villages. Joan of Arc 3 might have the cleansing of the Loire, but Grand Dukes 3 has the cleansing of Paris. Yeah, we can already start to see the similarities. Anyway, in this kind of A to B / RPG type scenario, you begin by witnessing a small scuffle at one of the gates to Paris, which your forces decisively win. You can then bring John the Fearless and the rest of your army forward through the gates into Paris. Your main objective here is to conquer the city by killing Bernard d'Armagnac himself, who is surrounded by his guard in the city's north on the far side of the Seine River. Also, fresh from his more or less victory in the Agincourt historical battle, Henry V is on his way to claim Paris for England. He arrives after around 45 minutes of game time, so you need to be sure to claim Paris for Burgundy before the English army shows up. Beyond all that, the core gameplay of this level involves skirmishing Armagnac forces in the city streets, completing side quests for various guild masters, and scrounging around the outside of the city for reinforcements. Okay, so first things first with the cleansing of Paris. I've gotta mention the map layout. It may look familiar. Indeed, the Paris in this map is almost identical to the Paris in Joan of Arc 5. It's a nice callback and bit of continuity between the two campaigns. I've put up the mini-maps of both scenarios on the screen so you guys can see just how, well, similar they are. Obviously, the colors roofs are different and there are several other small changes, but by and large, it's the same Paris. But map throwback aside, this is a fun little scenario and a nice break from the very standard build and destroy gameplay that we've had so far this campaign. The side quests with the guilds are interesting and totally fit the Burgundian strength through wealth theme, and the time limit with Henry V really ties the whole mission together to give you a sense of urgency. It's not the most memorable scenario out there, but I do think it's really well designed thematically. Alrighty, so the second half of this campaign turns from the adventures of John the Fearless to those of his son Philip the Good, beginning with the fourth scenario, Unholy Marriage. This unsanctimonious union is actually between Jacqueline of Hainault, Philip's cousin-in-law, and Humphrey of Lancaster in England. Together they are sparking a rebellion in the Burgundian Low Countries, so obviously Philip has to go put a stop to that. You begin with a modest camp to the west of the map and have the straightforward objective of defeating both Humphrey and Jacqueline. Humphrey's base is just to the north of your camp, whereas Jacqueline's stronghold is further northeast. You do have some potential allies in your struggle, however. The Duke of Bavaria is back to help you out, and his force to the far east of the map will complement your own. Lastly, there are two other factions on the map, each of whom will help you, but only if you fulfill their wealth-related side quest. There is the city of Cambressis in the south, and the county of Namur in the southeast. So, Unholy Marriage kind of resets the story to some degree, as now we are looking at a new protagonist in Philip the Good. However, we still find ourselves with another relatively large-scale build and destroy scenario featuring several different players. I'd say that this mission is pretty solid overall, and the side quests of bribing the local clergy in Cambressis with relics and a new cathedral, and then paying off the county of Namur really fit the whole Burgundian identity. Another interesting aspect of this mission is the positioning of you relative to your enemies. What I mean by this is that the fortresses of Humphrey and Jacqueline aren't all that far away from you in the north of the map. This leaves the center as kind of a no man's land with your allies to the east and neutral factions to the south. Overall, Unholy Marriage isn't all that challenging of a mission, but it's still a solid level with some nice thematics. Fifth in the Grand Dukes is the amazingly titled The Hook and Cod Wars, where Philip has to take down the scheming Humphrey of Lancaster and Jacqueline of Hainault for good. You begin with control of the small but well-defended port town of Braunschweig to the west of the map, whose town center you must protect for the entire scenario. To win, you will need to destroy the castles in the three strongholds of Jacqueline, Utrecht, Leiden, and Rotterdam, all of which are clustered to the far east of the map. Between you two are the twisting rivers and lowlands of Holland, which are dotted with numerous small villages. These are initially controlled by the Hook faction of lower noblemen, but if defeated, it will instead be controlled by the allied Cod faction of local merchants. Humphrey and the English are still hanging around, however, and they naturally control the sprawling coast of southern England to the northwest of the map across the English Channel. Humphrey will regularly harass you with his navy, as well as transport soldiers over to assist his wife. However, he can be pacified by destroying the few trade workshops located not too far away from the shoreline. Alright, so we've got quite a lot going on with the Hook and Cod Wars. Other than the fantastic name, I actually love the flavor and gameplay of this scenario, and it's definitely my favorite in the campaign. This is probably the single most challenging scenario in the Grand Dukes, as you don't start with a whole lot, you have to protect your starting town center, and your enemies will pursue you quite actively. Yes, again, we are looking at another build and destroy mission, but I feel like the map design here is unique enough to keep things interesting. You've got all of the twisting waterways of the Netherlands to restrict unit movement, but not to the degree where your units are getting stuck. The English are a powerful presence with a massive base, but they aren't actually necessary to destroy. And then of course you have the great thematics of the wealthy and conniving Burgundians supporting the rising merchant class over the nobility. Well, we knew this was coming, and I'm sure most of you can imagine what the final Grand Duke scenario, the Maid Falls, is all about. Indeed, your main objective in this level is to unhorse and capture Joan of Arc herself, who's located at the heart of Compiègne, a large fortified city to the southwest of the map. And yes, this is the same Compiègne from Joan of Arc 5, but I'll get back to that later. Arriving from the northeast, Philip the Good and his army first need a base of operations. Thankfully, your starting army can quickly conquer the nearby town of Choisy by just damaging its castle. Once you control Choisy, you can focus on taking the fight to the French. As mentioned, Compiègne is your strongest opponent, but they will be somewhat preoccupied by attacking your allies in the western town of Margny, so ensuring that the town stands will give you plenty of extra breathing room. Your other opponent in this scenario is of course the Army of France, who command a large camp across a river to the south of the map. They will be pretty aggressive in attacking you, but you can slow them down by destroying the bridge connecting their camp to Compiègne. You can also find a couple more helpful side quests at the town of Soissons to the east, whose inhabitants can be won over with some good old-fashioned bribery from the wealthy Burgundians. Alright, so the Maid Falls. Man, if you didn't feel like the bad guys before, you sure do now. I really want to like this scenario, and I almost do, but there's just one pretty major flaw. This mission is just way too easy, especially for a finale. It's not all that difficult to just boom to your Burgundian death ball and then slowly push into Compiègne while fending off the French army. Still, even if the Maid Falls isn't quite there in terms of difficulty in my opinion, I've got to give it a lot of credit in terms of flavor. I'll put another side-by-side on the screen right now, so as you can see, the fortified area in Compiègne where Joan is hanging out is heavily based off of the Compiègne you see in Joan of Arc 5, and that's definitely another nice bit of continuity. Beyond that, the side quests of the scenario are interesting and totally fitting of the Burgundians, meaning that there is enough going on to keep me interested. Okay, now that we have gone through all of the machinations of our Grand Dukes of the West, for the final time today, we're going to break down the campaign's strengths and weaknesses, and as I'm sure you've noticed, I think that this is an excellent campaign overall. When considering the strengths of the Grand Dukes campaign, two things jump out to me: the ambiance and the gameplay. Above all else, this campaign just does a damn good job of making you feel like a villain, but not in a cartoonish way. I haven't had the chance to mention the narration slides yet, but they do involve a Burgundian knight instructing his son on the recent history of the Burgundian rise to power, all on the eve of Joan of Arc's burning at the stake. Every scenario is framed in an incredibly cold and calculating manner, really emphasizing the dichotomy between the pragmatic Burgundian dukes with the ideologic zeal of Joan of Arc. And then, throughout the campaign, you play this out in a myriad of ways, most of which I've already highlighted in the missions themselves. You really do experience firsthand how the Burgundians are all about wealth and power. If those causes can be furthered by burning cities and killing peasants, you do that without a second thought. Conversely, if building up or financing local towns is more useful for your personal cause, you'll do that too. It's not about destruction for destruction's sake like an Attila the Hun. Secondly, I'd say that the Grand Dukes has some of the most consistently solid gameplay of any campaign in the game. None of the scenarios are bad, and even if I don't think any of them really stand out as incredible, I still enjoy going back through every single mission. Yes, there is a large emphasis on very classic Ensemble Studios style build and destroy scenarios, but I feel like they're all different enough from one another when it comes to gimmicks, side quests, and enemy factions to still feel unique. And to just quickly explain what I mean by Ensemble Studios style build and destroy scenarios, I'm referring to the sort of level design we saw in most of the Age of Kings and Conquerors campaigns. You build a base and have to destroy your enemy or enemies, with probably a few small twists or gimmicks. Also, you don't generally start with huge stockpiles of resources or near endless amounts of gold and stone to mine. This does make the gameplay a bit slower, but also more tactical and focused on securing map control. We see this play out in most scenarios in the Grand Dukes, as all but the third are designed in this style. Finally, throughout the campaign, you also get the opportunity to really utilize the strengths of the Burgundians: your powerful economy, cheap cavalry upgrades, strong gunpowder, and you even get some nice use from your relic team bonus. Of course, no campaign is perfect, and you know the drill. Now I've got to cover the things that felt a little bit off in our Grand Duke's adventure. First, as much as I loved the thematics of the campaign's narrative, the overarching progression and consistency didn't really feel too coherent. Part of this issue is that the campaign is literally split between two protagonists, John the Fearless and Philip the Good, with each getting 3 scenarios. Yes, they are father and son, and yes, the Philip story does pick up right where the John story ends, but it still feels a bit off when compared to the majority of the campaigns which are focused around a single figure, and then possibly their successor at the very end. Here, we didn't have a campaign mostly focused on John the Fearless, with Philip the Good sort of wrapping up his father's story. It's very much split between the two. This also has the secondary effect of having you feel like you're bouncing all over the place between each level without a clear sense of one scenario leading directly to the next, at least at several parts. Finally, the overall gameplay of the Grand Dukes is kind of a double-edged sword. Like I said, all of the scenarios are strong, but none of them really blew me away and sort of stick in my mind. No mission had a really memorable fight or mechanic that really puts it over the top when it comes to what I'd consider to be among the very best scenarios in the game. Still, this is nitpicking to some degree, and I'd rather have a campaign with strong, consistent scenarios than a campaign with having just 1 or 2 great scenarios and then the rest are mediocre. Alrighty, we've got one more campaign to place on the tier list today. Well, even with those critiques, I've still got to put Johnny F and Fiddle the G into the S tier. The Grand Dukes of the West is just a really strong, well-rounded campaign. One of my prerequisites for placing a campaign in S tier is that it has to have a majority of its scenarios be well above average. Grand Dukes checks that. It also has to have a memorable story with interesting characters. Again, Grand Dukes checks that. In general, I would describe our Burgundian campaign as the very traditional counterpart to the very unorthodox Sicilian Hautefeuille campaign, which I also put in S tier. Both are great, but in totally different ways. Yes, it's true that the Burgundians were not actually as diabolical as the Grand Duke's campaign portrays them, but every good story needs a villain, and with the 100 Years' War in AoE2, you couldn't ask for a better antagonist than the Grand Dukes of Burgundy. And just like that, we've now completed 21 campaigns. As of recording, we only have 3 episodes left, including the Dawn of the Dukes campaigns that I'll be doing in episode 10. Today was definitely a little bit on the lower side of the campaign tier ranking spectrum, but at least we ended strong with the Grand Dukes being in S tier. I'm sure I'll be getting plenty of flack for my relatively low placements of Joan and Leloy, but I think I'll be able to manage it. Anyways, that's gonna be it for this episode. Be sure to tune in next time when we cover a trio of the Forgotten campaigns with Sforza, Pachacuti, and Dracula. Lastly, as always, thank you so much for watching and enjoying this series. It really means a ton to me, and I'll see you guys next time.